Okay, I think we can start. Thank you for coming. Those who are on Zoom and those who are here, welcome to this new experiment holding hybrid events. Welcome to the inaugural event of the Dr. Robert Entman Award in Democracy and Political Communication, granted by the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. Thank you for coming to celebrate the work of Dr. Entman. I am Sylvia Weisberg, the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs. Our school established the award to honor and recognize Professor Entman's work. Professor Entman is an emeritus professor in our school. He was the Shapiro Professor of Media and Public Affairs and Professor of International Affairs. During his distinguished career, Dr. Entman has made key contributions to education and research in political communication with his work on framing, media and race, political scandal, and the dynamics of public opinion. The Entman Award is given annually for excellence in political communication research. In keeping with Professor Entman's long-standing contributions to the field, SMPA selects a political communication researcher whose work is publicly engaged, related to topics that are vital to the health of contemporary American democracy and of exceptionally high quality. Next, I will give the floor to my colleague Frank Cessno, the former director of SMPA, who worked with Dr. Entman in making this award possible.
Thank you, Silvio, and Professor Entman, Dr. Entman, Bob, I think you go by as well. It's wonderful to see you. It's great that we're here. And I'll just take a moment or two. It's an idea that came to us as we reflected on Bob's incredible contributions here at the School of Media and Public Affairs and more broadly to the field of political communication. It was one of the singular pleasures, privileges, and honors of my tenure in this position to work with Bob. I consider him a wonderful friend, but even more, there isn't a hallway encounter, a lunch, a coffee, or a conversation that goes by where Bob isn't challenging and sometimes opinionated, but always, but always brilliant about what we confront in our culture, in our society, in our media and information universe, and how that is conveyed, communicated, and framed to prompt what responds. Bob, it's been beyond a pleasure to work with you. I am so pleased that this prize and this event commences this evening. You have contributed so much in so many ways, and I'm very much looking forward to the talk this evening and to this wonderful tradition that will be ongoing. So, hail to you, my friend. Thanks for all you do.
Well, let me say thank you to my colleagues and friends at SMPA. It is an honor and a pleasure, and I look forward to many of these events. This is the first annual one, by the way, so under somewhat strange circumstances, I'm glad it can be held.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, hopefully next year is going to be less strange circumstances. So the best we can do, and thank you everybody for coming again. So now we're going to move to the part of the program which is going to present the award to the first, the inaugural recipient of the Entman Award, who is Dr. Danna Young, who's a professor of communication and political science at the University of Delaware. Our school recognizes Dr. Young for her engaging and path-breaking work in the field of political communication. Her work is rigorous, timely, and public-facing, which aligns with the example that Professor Entman has set throughout his career. Dr. Young has published over 40 academic articles and book chapters on the content, psychology, appeal, and effects of political information, satire, and misinformation. Her book, Irony and Outrage, which the selection committee mentions as one of Dr. Young's key contributions, examines satire and outrage as the logical extensions of the respective psychological profiles of liberals and conservatives. The book was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. From Dr. Young's extensive and distinguished resume, I would like to highlight her 2020 TED Talk explaining how our psychology shapes our politics and how media explores this relationship that I've seen multiple, but really multiple times. I encourage you to check them out on YouTube. Dr. Young publishes extensively in the popular press with essays and op-eds in outlets including Vox.com, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. Dr. Young is a research fellow with the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication and was awarded the University of Delaware's Excellence in Teaching Award. She holds a PhD with the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication. Next, Dr. Young will give an address for 20 minutes, reflecting on her current and past work and the relationship to Dr. Entman's scholarship, and then Dr. Entman will provide some comments. Before we move to Dr. Young, I would like to thank Dr. Dave Karff and other members of the selection committee for their work and for choosing Dr. Young. Dr. Young.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Is my audio good?
Oh, good.
Okay, you are my my test ride for my new fancy podcast microphone. So my hope is that we have really good audio. I want to start by saying a sincere thank you to GW's School of Media and Public Affairs, which is home to some really excellent friends and colleagues in political communication and even more excellent scholarship. When I received this letter from Dr. Weisborg congratulating me for being the inaugural recipient of the Dr. Robert Entman Award in Democracy and Political Communication, I was stunned and also so humbled. You see, before I was a political communications scholar, I majored in political science and French at the University of New Hampshire. And it wasn't until the second semester of my senior year of undergrad in spring of 1998 that I ventured outside of my political philosophy concentration. And I took a class entitled Media and Politics. And in it, I read Lance Bennett, Shanto Iyengar, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, and one Robert Entman. In retrospect, I think that Entman's 1991 book, Democracy Without Citizens, was the moment of my radicalization. Let's be honest. Not necessarily my political radicalization, though maybe, but my epistemological radicalization. That book was a sweeping account of the symbiotic relationship between politics and the press, the limitations of a market-based journalistic model, and how these factors interact to limit the ability of citizens to be thoughtfully engaged in politics. And most importantly to me, it offered suggestions of how we might disrupt these dysfunctional dynamics and improve democratic health. I was inspired, and it was in that same undergraduate class that I first encountered Entman's clear and elegant conceptualization of media framing. That frames, I'm sure many of us we can recite this in our sleep, frames select aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text. And the second half to me is the most important aspect of this definition, because he says, in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and or treatment recommendation. Now, before I talk to you about my own research, I want to discuss how elegant conceptualizations of complex communication concepts, like framing, can open the door to other questions, other big, fat questions, not just about the effects of media on individuals, but about why media content even looks the way it does, and why that matters to society and democracy. And I want to do it with an example from Bob's work. 2 weeks ago marked the official end of US military engagement in Afghanistan. After 20 years, that war was finally over. When President Biden addressed the country about the final troop withdrawal, he reminded the public, quote, "Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to be nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy." Well, then how did we end up in Afghanistan, and how did we end up there for so long? Here, I want to highlight a case study that Dr. Entman published 18 years ago, one articulated through the lens of his cascading activation model. Cascading activation offers a framework to think about how and why certain frames are used by elites and end up spreading through institutional networks and then resonating with the public, while others do not. This particular case study explored the post 9/11 war on terror frame used by the Bush administration as justification for war with Afghanistan. Entman examined the accessible, simple, and unifying war on terror frame that placed Afghanistan at its center. And he detailed the life cycle of a counterframe, one that challenged the notion that war with Afghanistan was the best course of action. And that counterframe was initially offered by Seymour Hersh and Thomas Friedman, two journalists who had basically asked, but why Afghanistan? Why not Saudi Arabia? After all, the majority of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudis. Saudi Arabia had long supported Islamic extremism. So why is Afghanistan at the center of the war on terror? Entman's analysis showed that this Saudi Arabia counterframe did not take hold. Why? In part, due to a lack of journalists willing to take up the mantle and a lack of political elites interested in jeopardizing political capital by complicating what had become a readily available, palatable course of action in Afghanistan. Because let's be honest, who liked the Taliban anyway? The Saudi Arabia frame, that counter frame, fizzled out. Even when the war on terror spread to a second country, Entman shows how Iraq, rather than Saudi Arabia, was, as he described, an easier sell due to cultural congruence. Cultural congruence. Americans already saw Saddam Hussein as the enemy. The Gulf War was only 10 years in the rearview mirror. You know, as a ninth grader in 90 and 91, I was the proud owner of a bumper sticker on my bedroom wall that said, Saddam, this scud's for you. I am part of that cultural congruence, Bob. So Iraq was a perfect fit. Saddam was a good enemy. And with such a salient bad guy, and without more political leaders willing to speak out about Saudi Arabia, when the Bush administration intent on surfacing information to support US engagement in Iraq as the central player in the war on terror frame cascaded through media to the public. And once again, Saudi Arabia was spared. And for the next 20 years, until 2 weeks ago, the US military was engaged in a war in Afghanistan. The usefulness of the cascading activation model is a testament to the explanatory power of the concept of framing itself. Sometimes working in political communication theory seems so vast and multi-layered that it's just too hard to even wrap your head around. It's the study of cognitive psychology, sociology, media, interpersonal communication, institutions, political motivations, economics, history, and culture. It is a lot. But the framework offered by cascading activation exemplifies how media theorists can move backwards from a well-explicated concept like framing to other levels of analysis. They can zoom out. They can go big, connecting economic and political incentives with journalistic routines and values, with micro-level cognitive approaches to media effects. In the cascading activation framework, the public does not merely enter the equation as an entity that is acted upon, but rather it's the conceptualizations of the public, it's anticipations of the public's needs and desires by elites that shape their strategies throughout the process. All four factors that Entman argues shape framing dynamics, those being motivations, power, strategy, and cultural congruence, like my bumper sticker. These are all audience-centered factors. Even when frames are motivated by economic incentives, those are audience-centered. Even when frames are motivated by reputational concerns of journalists, those are audience-centered. Political strategy is about what frames will move the audience. News strategy is about what frames will play well with the audience. And cultural congruence is about what frames will resonate with the audience. It's in the anticipation, it is the anticipation of characteristics and responses of people, regular people, that drive the behaviors of elites. Politicians, journalists, news organizations, institutions. And that right there, that kind of integrative approach, multi-level approach to the study of media and politics is what we need more of, especially right now. Absent theoretical considerations of how patterns of human behavior are themselves anticipated by media logics, by elites, I don't know how we're going to identify the vectors of influence that are capable of disrupting the dysfunctional, anti-democratic processes that are currently at play. So this kind of comprehensive approach to the study of political media is what I've tried to start offering in Irony and Outrage. And it's also what I'm hoping to do in my new book about the relationship between identity and misinformation. So you may know my scholarly journey began with the study of how people understand jokes. And now I study how misinformation is threatening democratic and public health. So clearly I did something wrong in my journey, because this is not nearly as much fun as that was. However, both of these areas study this concept, vaguely conceptualized concept of fake news, right? Back then I was studying news parodies, like The Daily Show, but then it evolved into the study of conservative outrage programming, a genre that cloaks itself in the trappings of news, but is not news at all. And now I study mis and disinformation, which is a category that can overlap with both outrage and satire. I began studying the psychology of humor, and my early work explored how the heavy cognitive work required to understand a joke reduces the resources we have left over to critique the premise of that joke. This is why jokes are less likely to make us so mad. In the context of satire that uses humor to advance a political argument, this is important, right? And it seems like it might explain at least some of the magic of folks like Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. But the notion that satire and irony are cognitively taxing introduced a whole other line of inquiry into the potential ideological bias of satire. What if the rhetorical structure of satire itself is more suited to certain psychological traits? And what if these traits correlate with political preferences? That question became my book, Irony and Outrage. Folks used to always ask me why satire seemed to have a liberal bias, and I could never land on a suitable answer until I started to zoom out. I started studying political psychology, and there I learned that liberals and conservatives differ on important psychological traits related to threat monitoring and threat management. Conservatives are more attuned to potential threats in their environments, which makes them less tolerant of uncertainty. It also means they're motivated by efficiency, and so they rely on emotions and heuristics when making decisions. Liberals, meanwhile, are less concerned about interpersonal threats, so it's sort of a luxurious position to be in because they're higher in tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. They also tend to be higher in need for cognition than conservatives. So as I mentioned, irony is cognitively taxing and ambiguous. It requires the processing of a literal text, followed by the integration of prior knowledge, then the inversion of the text to realize that the real meaning of the text is not what Stephen Colbert actually said, but exactly its opposite. Okay, if I am a conservative, motivated by efficiency and closure, this kind of political discourse should not appeal to me. Sure enough, conservatives are less likely to comprehend and appreciate ironic satire. And these outcomes are explained in part by the lower need for cognition and higher need for closure of conservative audiences. So if satire appeals to the psychology of liberals, then what on earth appeals to the psychology of conservatives? You may ask. 2 words: Sean Hannity. Clear identification of threats, no riddles, efficient, emotional, clear, strong moral authority. It's what Jeff Berry and Sarah Soberai call outrage programming. Well, then my work was done, right? Like, I'm free to go. I figured it out. Let's, I don't know, go find something else to do. Except the implications of this theoretical framework don't end with this explanatory model. They're just beginning. Because right away it became apparent that the synergy between the psychological traits and the preferred aesthetics of the left and the right were not symmetrical. What do I mean? As I write in the book, it is the symbiosis between outrage and the underlying psychology of social and cultural conservatism that renders conservative outrage especially fruitful as an avenue for strategic political persuasion. So it's the interaction of right-wing populist, emotional, threat-oriented hyperbole with the conservative audience's need for closure. That's the recipe for mobilization. So now I'm studying how these asymmetrical psychological patterns relate to mis and disinformation in our media environment. And I'm doing it taking into account large-scale phenomena like the social sorting of America's political parties on dimensions of race, religion, and geography that's been documented by Liliana Mason and others. I'm doing it taking into account things like the economics of digital media that incentivize the performance of identity. You know what? The broader I go, the more convinced I am that there are ways out of this dysfunctional spiral. Because if we can explicate the cycle that drives mis and disinformation, then we can identify avenues of intervention to disrupt it. And what I'm finding, and this is a teaser, is that once we start thinking of misinformation and disinformation, not on the supply side, but rather as problems of demand. And once we start thinking about where that demand comes from, then we might start to fix this mess. So that's what I'm hoping to do next. Thank you to SMPA for this tremendous award. Thank you, Dr. Weisbord. Thank you to the committee members. And thank you, Dr. Entman, for being a model of engaged scholarship that helps us understand complex dynamics that exist between citizens, media content, journalistic and media institutions, and political actors. And most of all, thank you for going big.
Thank you, Dr. Young. I would like to invite Dr. Entman for commentary remarks.
Thank you, Dana. That was terrific. Thank you for your kind remarks, and thank you for remembering democracy without citizens. By the way, does focus on the demand side and the paradox that if you're not well enough informed to demand high quality journalism, you won't demand it. And if you don't get high quality journalism, you won't be well enough informed. So there's a real paradox that we're still dealing with, and I think Dana is continuing along that path, which is great. I wanted to say a few things, far too brief, because I'm very constrained in time. Much as I hate this, but I have to stick to the time limit. I want to focus particularly on Dana's concern with polarization in irony and outrage. And my theme is that perhaps there's something called good polarization that can help to save American democracy from these downward spirals, from the kind of deepening polarization that that Dana explores, which does threaten our political system, yet as she shows so convincingly, is baked into today's media system and to some extent, possibly into our very genes. By itself, polarization in the sense of strong disagreement between people on the left and the right isn't always a threat. What's more concerning may be polarization along a second spectrum that I want to specifically identify, and that is support for the values and norms of democracy. If you think about the political theorists who shaped American political thought in the post-World War years, certainly shaped political science when I was in grad school, they started from one core premise. All elites in the US must, and very importantly, do share a commitment to democracy itself. In particular, to procedural norms that guarantee willingness to engage in good faith negotiation and compromise. This is how government gets to solve problems in a democracy while paying attention to public opinion and protecting democracy itself. Until the 1990s, there was no polarization about this. There was overwhelmingly an elite consensus on the value of democracy and these norms. During the 90s, the more conservative team of party elites began abandoning their commitment. Let's be frank about it, Frank. This shift among Republican elites yields what I call bad polarization, what we have today. That is, I'm going to define it as such acute disagreement between party elites that they cannot bargain and compromise to solve policy problems or protect democracy in practice. But I want to suggest three further distinctions in considering polarization. First, I think it's good to remember there's less left-right polarization among ordinary citizens, the mass public, than there is among elites. Second, many citizens are non-ideological, have shifting or no party identifications. By definition, they can't be polarized in the way that we usually talk about it. And third, as I've already suggested, maybe sometimes polarization is actually a good thing. One example of less polarization among citizens than elites. The New York Times recently reported that 84% of the public, including over 75% of Republicans, support adding dental coverage to Medicare. That's one of many possible examples, from gun regulation to taxing the rich, of less polarization between Democrats and Republicans at the mass level among the ordinary citizen than among the leaders of the party. Now, beyond party loyalists and party elites who do cling to the ideological poles are those free-floating citizens who don't consistently identify with liberalism or conservatism or with either party. These are actually the swing voters who determine elections. Typically, they are less well-informed, pay less close attention to politics, and honestly, they're often quite confused. But one thing they're not is polarized, by definition. Okay, and on the third point I wanted to make, when's polarization good? Consider Ezra Klein's recent op-ed in the New York Times on Afghanistan. He suggests we might often want strong disagreement over policy among elites. Polarization isn't always bad. Around 2003-04, we could have used it. We could have used it if we defined good polarization as vigorous but substantive and sincere policy disagreement between party elites. That might have helped avoid the disastrous outcomes in Afghanistan and Iraq. I wonder what Dana thinks about this. Might we sometimes want more polarization in this sense of clear but rational disagreement by one party's leaders with the bad ideas of the others? But can we have such good polarization without its leading to bad? I'm interested in Dana's and your thoughts about that. Let me advance one idea building on Dana's analysis. Perhaps American democracy and good polarization require that both parties place a high value on efficiency, which, as Dana said, right now only the conservatives tend to do. I suggest that democratic elites' choice of irony, along with associated complexity, ambiguity, cognition, instead of communication that's simple, clear, straightforward, and emotional, in other words, efficient, this is one thing that's allowed bad polarization to flourish. It's the very things that Danna shows that characterizes liberals that actually is encouraging, enabling the bad polarization we have now. So to explain my claim in terms of Danna's work, well-educated democratic elites fail to understand that the unpolarized swing voters, who are really the target audience here and determine elections, are much less like themselves than they are like ordinary conservative citizens. That's to say, the non-aligned, non-ideological citizen is often not especially attuned to complexity, cognition, and irony. Democrats might mobilize them more efficiently with a little more outrage, clearly and simply communicated. Let me give you a couple examples of what Democrats do wrong from recent days. Biden recently called Republican governors' actions on COVID counterintuitive and a little disingenuous. What percentage of the citizenry knows the definition of those words? Why not call the governors unfit and immoral? Or worse. Or no, let me ask those of you in the audience, what is the name of that $3.5 trillion policy program that Biden's been pushing? What's it, what do you call it? What's the name of it? I'll tell you what it's called. It's called the $3.5 trillion program. No emotion generating, no mobilizing label like the New Deal, for example. That's the Democrats in a nutshell. And why this is significant is not merely because I'm voicing my typical frustration with Democrats. It's that I believe it enables the Republicans to maintain extreme positions and refusal to compromise. Democrats' ineffective political communication consistently undermines their electoral majorities when they do manage to win power. That weakens their hold on swing voters and rewards Republican intransigence. Indeed, Biden and the Democrats are expected to lose their control of Congress next year. Yet broad majorities, including substantial numbers of Republican citizens, support many Democratic policies. I would submit more majorities support Democratic policy than support the Republican platform. As Danna says, clashing ideological tendencies are rooted in personality, perhaps even genetics. When it's good polarization, this tension can be productive for democracies. If Democrats were to mount a more competitive partisan communication effort, it might force Republican elites to their senses and back to the good faith bargaining table. Can that occur under the self-reinforcing polarized media system that Danna and others have described? I don't know. But in my view, it definitely cannot happen if the Democratic politicians don't up their game. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both again, and now we open the floor for comments, questions. Try to identify yourself.
If Danna has any answers to my questions, I'd be interested.
Yeah, well, can I take a stab at some of the things that Bob brought up? So let me just say, I don't think that political polarization is actually the biggest problem right now. I think that it's like many of my political colleagues, it's an issue of anti-democratic norms that is the problem. So it is okay if the two sides disagree on issues. What's not okay is bringing the gears of government to a standstill and undermining democratic processes in the process. So what I think is more problematic and why I would give a little bit of pushback about the idea of the folks in the middle. Even though the folks in the middle are not knowledgeable, they're not engaged. I think that our politics have become so all-encompassing that even people who are not big P political, they are part of this sort of cultural soup that causes them to identify with certain kinds of people and certain ways of thinking and living. So even those people who are not thinking of themselves as ideological people, I think that our identities have become so subsumed, right? Like racial, religious, whether we're urban or rural, what we do for fun, whether we hunt and fish or go to museums, all that stuff, that apolitical stuff is political. And so I think that there is a huge divide happening even among those individuals who would not consider themselves political. And that I see it as problematic. The other piece of it, let me just say, I thought about whether or not Democrats should, quote unquote, should strategically adopt the rhetoric and aesthetics of outrage. What's interesting to me is, for example, I talked to some folks who really do not like Rachel Maddow. Rachel Maddow is the closest thing that the left has to an outrage host, right? And when I say, why don't you like Rachel Maddow? And they're like, God, I hate being told what to think. And it's like, I got it, okay? You've said it 5 times, like, I got it. Like, let's move on. And to me, it almost feels as though if you operate against the preferred aesthetic, I don't know if that will resonate. I don't know if that will work. You know, in health communication, we talk about how persuasion is most likely when there's that match, right, between psychological structures and traits with the structure of a message. And I just don't know. I just don't know if it worked. I also wonder if tapping into that sort of notion of like efficiency and threat and emotions and heuristics, would that then transform liberals into something else entirely? I just don't know. But those are great questions to chew on.
Thank you. Yes?
I have a question. So my name is Tyler. I'm a senior at George Washington University studying organizational sciences and minoring in communications. And my question is for you, Ms. Danna, and thank you so much for being with us. In your book, you talked a lot about the defragmentation of mass audiences that kind of happened with the regulation kind of the FCC and all that kind of backlash after Reagan. And I was wondering if you made any connections with maybe some evolutions in our media channels, such as digital media, Facebook, and Twitter, that you may even see kind of either coalescing those mass audiences or defragmenting those audiences more, and what your kind of general thoughts might be about that.
Yeah, that's it. I feel like Tyler set me up. Like, I feel like you're like a plant, like you're like a Confederate, because so I wrote an editorial with our friend Shannon McGregor, who's now at UNC Chapel Hill, right before the world imploded. It was like it was published in like February 2020. But it was basically about how the logic, affordances, and economics of social media are tailor-made for political propaganda, that they embed information within interpersonal networks, number one. Number two, the use of user data to micro-target information and inform people's algorithms, that in and of itself is a reinforcement mechanism, and it can sort of canalize beliefs. And the notion that, and by the way, all these 3 things come from a 1948 essay by Lazarsfeld and Merton, where they basically said, you need these 3 things in order to satisfy in order for propaganda to work, and they'll never be met. Well, cut to 2020, and it's like all of that stuff exists now. They basically said, you need to have propaganda supplemented by interpersonal communication, which Facebook does. You need it to canalize or reinforce existing beliefs, which means you need to know people's beliefs to start, which the data do. Number three, you need to have monopolization, which people were like, you'll never have that because, you know, it's private companies that create the information. We'll never have government control. What they didn't understand was that at the level of the individual, if I am self-selecting into certain information, and if algorithms are informing what I'm receiving, then for all intents and purposes, my information environment is monopolized by a certain narrative. So all three of those criteria that were not satisfied then are satisfied now, and it's because of the sort of hyper fragmentation and segmentation that's encouraged through digital information structures.
Thank you.
Anybody else? No.
So I want to come at this as the not so recovering journalist in the room. For my years at CNN, and when I was at CNN, and I was bureau chief at CNN, I wrote what I consider to be an infamous memo to the reporters at one point saying, when you were live on the air, please try to avoid two words, and those words would be I think. The audience doesn't care what you think. They care what you see, what you've heard, what you've witnessed. We call that reported. That memo belongs in a museum right now, right next to a newspaper, especially a local newspaper, because these are all, you know, lovely, quaint objects from the distant past.
Yeah.
As I watch what used to be mainstream media and listen, I am beyond disheartened at the Hannityization and the Maddowization, not just of those hosts, but news reporting by what should be, you know, sort of straight down the middle, what used to be straight down the middle reporting. Well-known Tim Russert would sort of give everybody a hard time. And I was, as you were speaking, I was struck by sort of a thought that I think there was a time, not terribly long ago, where you could find very different frames on a particular channel. I'm thinking mostly the cable news. Now those channels themselves are defined by a particular frame. So I'm very interested in your thoughts as to what role you think different, because you spoke about journalism, different media organizations have in reinforcing this cascade. And I'm also really interested in this little bit of optimism you shed with your comments about there are actually ways to disrupt this. I would feel much better if I could have some of that.
I don't know if I'm allowed to do that yet because the book's not done. Am I allowed to do that? I don't know.
You can hint at it. You know?
So those are great points, and I'll tell you, I know a lot of folks share your concerns when they watch CNN, and they share your concerns not because they are conservatives who are mad because it's biased, but they are people who are looking for some kind of objective treatment of the issues. And it is increasingly difficult to turn to CNN and say that this is what is being offered through this programming, especially because there are so many opinion shows on during prime time. It's all these opinion programs. So again, I'm going to say I trace this back to what is being demanded. And I just want to be careful here, because when I say this is an issue of demand, you know, a lot of times, for example, the film industry, when explaining why they have so much violence and gore and yuckiness in their films, they'd say that's what people want. So it was like blaming the audience, like that's what they want, that's why we do this. Well, that was disingenuous for various reasons. And so is the idea that, like, okay, we're just giving people what they want. When I say demand is responsible, I need to really be careful because I do not think that that demand is organic. That demand does not just come from within me. I don't just want opinion programming. We are swimming in a soup that is in part fueled by political social sorting of the parties, in part by media fragmentation that's trying to appeal to certain audiences, in part by these social media logics that really want to reinforce identities and reinforce identities by encouraging us to perform those identities online, right? Oh, well, now you can perform what it is to be a liberal, perform what it is to be a conservative. And the economics of these industries are predicated on those performances. So it's basically, there's all this machinery that is incentivizing this cultivation of these identities that are, it's almost like, it's like a funhouse mirror, right? It's not what you actually look like. It is an exaggeration of what these mechanics need you to look like. So that is what I see is responsible for this. So when I'm thinking about avenues to disrupt it, number one, I have been very frustrated by the outcome that I'm most interested, by the way, is like belief in mis and disinformation, because I see that as symptomatic of all these other things, but that is problematic. And so one of the things that I think is responsible for belief in mis and disinformation is on that side of demand. Well, everybody is trying to figure out, how do we deplatform people? How do we do content moderation? How do we block accounts? How do we take this information down? I'm like, that is an exercise in futility, because as long as people want to be told lies, sweet little lies, those lies will show up. So the question is, how do we disrupt the cycle? One way to disrupt the cycle, I think, is the demonetization of some of these sites, where if there is not that encouragement to appeal to categories of content that are going to cause emotional arousal or elicit those engaged responses, I think that that in and of itself will moderate that content, not moderate the content like take it down. I think it will literally soften the content because the incentive structure will have changed. That's one. Two, there are aspects of our culture that are inherently fighty, for lack of a better phrase, and that often want us to pick a side and perform that side. And I'm working with a psychological trait called epistemic humility. It's actually a psychological trait that's used a lot in the religion literature. Who knew? But epistemic humility is the notion that, hey, I might be wrong. I have this belief, I have this thought, but I might be wrong. And to me, epistemic humility is actually the philosophy at the heart of scientific inquiry, right? Falsifiability is what we try to do as scientists. We try to say, like, you know what? I'm going to try to prove myself wrong. And we never, ever accept for a fact that what we've done is proven and that it's true. We never remove ourselves from doubt. So I'm trying to find ways to engage that concept of epistemic humility and incentivize epistemic humility. Right now, our media environment rewards strong opinions and outburst and the performance of strong opinions. But there are ways to change that incentive structure. So.
I sense that Dr. Edmund has something to say. Dr. Edmund.
Yeah, I very much agree with your points there, Dana. However, you do need some leadership to make this all happen.
Yes.
And,
elite voices matter a lot, unfortunately.
Yes. And in order to get through to people, to perhaps encourage some demand from the public to regulate or otherwise incentivize or disincentivize media organizations. You need some elites to be selling that point of view against the very simple, deeply culturally congruent idea, First Amendment.
Yeah.
If I had time, I'd talk to you about all of these things that you're mentioning that are happening in my little 40 household community, which is a co-housing community where we are going through all these identity issues and having all kinds of feuds, and you wouldn't believe it. And that there's no political, disagreement among us. It's not about that. Anyway, how do you get leaders to start leading? And I think, I was influenced by your very, elegant description of how simple communication is actually a way to get through to a lot of people. I don't think it's neither the only way to get through to conservatives, nor is complexity the only way to get through to liberals. So you can have a mix of strategies, and without a mix, I submit, we are lost.
I would agree.
In particular, the party that has not abandoned democratic norms, and you might say abandoned rationality at this point with disinformation and the stolen election and all that, it rests on the Democrats. Not that I'm thrilled with them in any particular way, but they're the ones left who can articulate some of the very concerns you're saying, but that has to be done. You can't talk in the terms you and I and the people sitting in the room here talk and think. You've got to, reduce it to some things, maybe about patriotism, maybe about liberty and independence of thought, things like that. So, I think there's a lot of fruitful work to be done, and I'm really excited about reading your next work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes left in the program. One more question, comment?
I'll ask it. Hi, Dana. It's Rebecca.
Hi,
So-
Rebecca.
Hi. We have, I think as you know, at SMPA, we have two main undergraduate programs in journalism and polycom. And we have a number of our students with us this evening. So I was wondering what advice you would give to them. Some of them are a year or 2 or 3 away from going out into the field and actually putting the things that we teach them about into practice. This is the next generation of true practitioners applying all of this. What from your work in Irony and Outrage would you tell future journalists, future polycom professionals are the most important things for them to take out into the world?
That is a super difficult. You could have emailed me ahead of time.
Sorry.
That's like very, very hard. Okay. That's a very good question. So there's 2 dimensions to this, right? One is the sort of normative question related to democratic health. The other is, what's going to make them a whole lot of money? And I'm here to tell you those are likely mutually exclusive. My thought is this. When I talk to my undergraduates and my master's students as they're heading off into the world, I feel like when we're in the classroom, we're describing the world the way that things are, right? We're giving them a sense of the way things are right now. It's very descriptive, and we offer some prescriptive information as well. But in terms of, for me, the most important thing for my students is for them to be armed with the notion that all of these processes and institutions and all of these phenomena that we study, they're actually the result of human beings. They're not disembodied forces that just exist. They're informed in part by very abstract forces, but they are the doing of human beings, right? So the notion that I'm just a person, I'm just entering this system. The system is people. So individual people have agency to shape the institutions that they work within. So just because you're okay, so this is the profit model and this is how it works, and now I'm a part of the machine and this is what I do, you have agency because individual human beings created the dynamics that are responsible for those incentives in the first place. I think we forget that. I mean, I think as scholars, we forget that. And to me, that would be my message.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is 7 p.m. We scheduled it for 1 hour. I'm sure there's all kinds of other questions. We'll probably continue that by email. Other forms of communication. So I want to thank Dr. Entman and Dr. Young for
Thank you so
comments,
much.
for your work, for your inspiration. Let me give you the closing words to Dr. Young first, and then to Dr. Entman.
I just want to say thank you so much. This was such an honor. I'm so sad that we are still in the midst of this, situation we're in. But I am excited to see my colleagues in person, hopefully within the next year. Especially for students, the notion that these processes are the result of human beings who engage in behaviors that shape outcomes, that is so important. And I think as Polcom scholars, we often forget that. And that is what I would take with you. And I will try to do the same. And Bob, thank you so much for commenting on my work. This was really an honor.
Thank you. Dr. Entman?
Thank you. Well, it's an honor for me to have this award named in my name. And I'm so pleased that Dana was the first recipient. I particularly, just enjoyed the way she writes. She writes in a very engaging way, and she talks about herself a little. She didn't mention this evening, but she's had another career as a stand-up comedian, which maybe you can tell from the way she presents. I wish all professors had that extra talent. Sure, some of the students do as well. And a word to the students, these are pretty discouraging times. And as I look back now that I'm retired on my college years, we had this sense of kind of endless hope, and I have trouble seeing how you guys can feel that way. But there is some hope, and what I can guarantee is that there is no hope if people don't act in the assumption that they can make a difference, and I think they can. And maybe Dana and I have even suggested a few ways by which that might happen. So let's end on a somewhat positive note then, an encouraging note, because I think we deserve it.
Thank you. Famous saying by Kafka, saying there is hope, but not for us. And but I think that this kind of conversation actually makes me hopeful, because the kind of conversation that I actually enjoy, and we hope that we have sort of a large scale conversations, with the democracy about these kind of issues. So thank you very much to both of you and everybody else for attending, for your comments, and see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.